Many winters ago, I was a philosophy student, and as part of my master's degree, I did a course on the philosophy of human rights. We covered a range of topics and traditions of thought, including probably most prominently the so-called capabilities approach to human rights. And at the time, that course left me a little bit unsatisfied. I thought back then that that was because the course material we'd been studying was insufficiently critical, in my opinion, of the liberal individualism that underpins so much human rights discourse. But I now know that it was because this book hadn't been written yet. If it had, I'm sure it would have been taught on that course, and also that it would have absolutely blown me away. And that's because Being Social, which, as Despina said, was edited by Kimberley Brownlee, David Jenkins, and Adam Neal, is a truly excellent book. It's excellent because it succeeds brilliantly at its stated aim, which is to open up a long overdue conceptual and political conversation about the place of social rights within the broader field of human rights discourse. But it's also excellent because it does this with a level of clarity and accessibility that most academic texts can only dream of. And finally, it's an excellent book because it doesn't shy away from internal disagreement and even, at some points, friction. Instead of suggesting that there exists some kind of philosophical or moral consensus on social rights, the book explicitly foregrounds the conceptual and moral tensions that currently mark the debate on these themes. So we at the Independent Social Research Foundation are very, very pleased to be hosting this book launch today, because the foundation has a special interest in precisely the kind of work that is contained in this book. The ISRF is primarily a research funder, and our primary aim is to support socially relevant but conceptually innovative work. And this book broaches a crucial set of questions. This becomes clear from the very first page of the book. So the first sentence of the introduction runs as follows, I quote, "Certain rights are essential to a minimally decent human life because when these rights go unmet, human life becomes unbearable." And the sort of thing the editors have in mind when they talk about these social rights include the following forms of interpersonal interaction: decent human contact, acknowledgement, social inclusion, connection, relationship, intimacy, and shared ways of living, as well as our competing interests in solitude and associative freedom. That, again, was a quote from the first page. Now, in my opinion, philosophy doesn't get much more relevant or conceptually novel than this. The ISRF has worked with Kimberley since 2014, when she was one of our early career fellows. And the research that she did as part of her fellowship ended up culminating in her brilliant 2020 book, Being Sure of Each Other, which I'm sure everyone who is present at this book launch is also familiar with. The ISRF had the pleasure of organizing a book launch for that book as well, which took place as far back as March 2021. And for anybody who is interested, a video recording of that launch is available on the ISRF's website, and my colleague Despina will circulate a link in the chat in a moment. There we go. That book launch for Being Sure of Each Other was the fourth one that we did here at the ISRF, and today's is the 20th. So this has been a very successful program, and we're really grateful to all of our speakers and panelists for making these book launches into such a success and also into such a pleasure to host. So here's how this launch is going to work. Shortly, I'm going to introduce Kimberley, Adam, and David, our three editors, who will speak for about 15 minutes about the book, where it came from, its contributions, and its aspirations. After that, we're going to hear from three further speakers who have kindly joined us today to share their thoughts on and questions about the volume. They will each speak for about 5 to 7 minutes or so. And after that, we'll briefly go back to the editors for their response. And then finally, we're going to go into the Q&A, where we will hopefully get some interaction from the audience. Okay, I'm going to now introduce our three initial speakers. Kimberley Brownlee holds the Canada Research Chair in Ethics and Political and Social Philosophy at the University of British Columbia. Her current work focuses on loneliness, belonging, social human rights, and freedom of association. She's the author of 2 monographs, Being Sure of Each Other, which I already mentioned, and which came out in 2020, and Conscience and Conviction, The Case for Civil Disobedience, which came out in 2012, both with Oxford University Press. Adam Neal is a Leverhulme Trust funded doctoral researcher in philosophy at the University of Warwick. His research concerns the social and interpersonal implications of poverty, the philosophy of work, and the ethics of relationships. He has co-authored forthcoming work on different conceptions of what it means to be a neighbor, so keep your eye out for that. And third, David Jenkins is a lecturer in political theory at the University of Otago, Aotearoa, New Zealand. He was previously a postdoctoral fellow in the philosophy department at the University of Warwick, and he has published work on unconditional basic income, James Baldwin and recognition, as well as various other topics besides. Kimberley, Adam, and David, it's our pleasure and honor to host the three of you.
Thank you very much, Lars, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the ISRF for hosting this launch, to Despina, to Chris, to Stuart, and to you, Lars. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And it's a pleasure to be able to introduce this collection. It brings together the work of leading figures in human rights theory, rising stars in these debates. We were very fortunate to have the funding of the AHRC and the Leverhulme Trust to hold a conference where the contributors first presented their work, and then 3 years later to bring out this volume with OUP. I'll say a bit about the underlying ambition of the book, and then Adam and David will each give more detailed overviews of some of the chapters. The aim is to forefront the poorest of the poor cousins. In human rights debates, socioeconomic rights tend to be the poor cousins, and then within that family, social rights are the poorest. Socioeconomic rights are the rights that protect our interests in shelter, food, health, education, culture, and community. And they've sometimes been described not just as the poor cousins, but possibly the false relations of the rights that protect our interests in due process, physical safety, political participation, freedom of movement, speech, and religion. Some scholars say that socioeconomic rights are actually of a different logical category, that they are best thought of as liberal aspirations or a shopping list of desirable goods, and not as the objects of human rights. Now, significant inroads have been made over the past 30 years to defend our economic welfare rights, so those rights to be free from poverty, health, education, shelter, subsistence. These very few scholars would deny now that these are indeed human rights. But the same argumentative inroads haven't yet been made systematically on behalf of our social rights, and this collection aims to take the first few steps toward remedying that neglect. Henry Shue, as students of human rights will know, has made seminal contributions to human rights debates by showing just how fundamental specific rights are, namely the rights to subsistence and rights to shelter, and that in order for us to realize other human rights that we think we sort of take more for granted, due process, freedom of speech, and so on, he says without our subsistence and physical security rights being met, these other rights won't be realizable. So if we don't have nourishing food and potable water and physical security and decent shelter, we won't be able to exercise clear thought. And clear thought is a condition for exercising our right to vote, to stand for office, to participate politically, to practice our religion. And so in his view, these rights related to subsistence and shelter, these are basic. And prior to the publication of this collection, Henry Shue hadn't considered whether his list might be too short, whether there might be an item missing from his list. And in his chapter in this book, he makes a notable contribution by expanding his concept of basic rights to include our interests in social inclusion. He draws on the work of Elizabeth Ashford, who identifies a method for picking out a basic right, and that is, would a person forego any other right in order to secure the right in question? And he uses that thought and draws on empirical literature as well to show that opportunities for social contact, inclusion, and enculturation are vital for the development and maintenance of our cognitive capacities. He says that without the development and maintenance of these capacities, the very concept of personhood becomes threatened. And so these concerns are in fact more basic than basic. Now, there is a general theoretical neglect of social rights to date that is mirrored in human rights practice. And just one example of this, which is quite striking, is that in the 2015 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, there is no goal specifically related to our social needs. And none of the 17 goals that are identified, none of them have targets that explicitly relate to social needs. So there are various indicators of progress that gesture in the direction of social integration and related values. And much attention is paid within the Sustainable Development Goals to basic material needs, which is sort of further proof that those argumentative inroads of the last 30 years have had their effect. There's an appreciation of our material needs, our economic welfare needs. But it also confirms that our social rights are the poorest of the poor cousins to this point. Now, in other fields, in social psychology and neuroscience, very important work is being done to show just how fundamental our social needs are, that these are needs with a capital N, that we thirst for connection, that sociality is baked into our nervous system, in Vivek Murthy's terms, and that these needs are very much intertwined with our political and material interests. Someone who has insufficient material or temporal resources cannot be social in certain ways, cannot be a host to others, doesn't have the leisure to be hospitable, will struggle to be a hands-on caregiver, will struggle to meet their own needs and their dependents' needs for contact and community. And this has ramifications not only for their interests as a social creature, but also for their material and political interests. Someone who has to devote all of their time to commuting and to working in order to make ends meet and keep their, pay their rent, keep their house. Someone who lacks the money to join in social and political activities will be marginalized and more vulnerable to corrosive forms of disadvantage. And so this indicates that social rights protect us not only as social beings, they also protect us from other kinds of disadvantage and harm. So that's a brief overview of the the thoughts that drive the discussion in the book, and I'll turn it over to Adam.
Thank you, Kim. I just want to echo Kim's words and to thank Lars and the ISRF, and thanks to all the participants in this book launch. It's great to see everyone. So a key contribution of several of the chapters in this book is to defend specific social rights grounded in particular interests, as Kim was saying, that we have as social beings. So Kim has done this in previous work, defending the right against social deprivation. And in this collection, Alexandra Couto, in her chapter, examines two possible interpretations of the interest that grounds the right against social deprivation. Now, the first interest that she identifies is the importance of protecting our opportunities to cultivate meaningful relationships with family and friends. Now, the second alternative interest is a kind of more basic kind of social interest in social contact that could take the form of a purely non-associative decent interactions. So just kind of talking to people on the street that you don't necessarily aren't necessarily your friends or family. Now, Couto in her chapter defends the first interpretation, arguing that it better captures the fundamental social interests that underpin this core human right. But even this second kind of interest in decent non-associative interactions can be really important. So especially for people who don't have those opportunities to interact decently with other people that often. So think about the older person, isolated, who only gets to talk to the shopkeeper, for example, or homeless people would be maybe another example. So in Kim's chapter, she defends our rights to have adequate opportunities to meet and interact with non-associates and to benefit from the modeling, the exchange of views, and the affirmation of our general acceptance, which associative interaction provides. So an important theme within this collection concerns the different kinds of interactions and relationships over which we might have rights. So probably the most intimate kind of relationship that we have in this collection is the right to marry. Now, Jenny Brown in her chapter takes on recent arguments by Claire Chambers and Elizabeth Brake, who call for the disestablishment of marriage. Now, Brown maintains that if the call to disestablish marriage is motivated by egalitarian concerns to better protect a universal right to marry, then actually retaining legal marriage serves that purpose equally well, and, she argues, is indeed necessary to ensure such equality. Another kind of interaction that could be the subject for social rights is the right to be loved. So Matthew Lau, in previous work, has argued that children have the right to be loved. Now, in this collection, he extends his empirically informed arguments for the right to be loved to older people. And he argues that love is necessary for the physical health and cognitive function of older people. And he uses this to ground the right to be loved for older people. Now, it's important to acknowledge the limits to social rights. So in this collection, Stephanie Collins examines a classic problem within the ethics of sociability, that between our kind of social needs and our needs for associative control. And in her chapter, Collins examines this tension between our needs for intimacy and our needs for associative control. And she argues that we don't have a human right to intimacy as such, but we do have a right to intimacy consideration, which gives others a duty to deliberate about our needs for intimacy and our intimacy inclinations, to deliberate and also to act accordingly on those deliberations. So we don't have a human right to intimacy, but we do have a human right to intimacy consideration. And along similar lines, Simon Hope's chapter challenges the intended universality of rights talk, that we kind of see human rights as this universal concept for thinking about issues, including the ethical implications of sociability. Now, Hope draws on some of the struggles that the Maori people have waged over territorial and sovereignty issues in New Zealand, and he provides a riposte, or at least a partial riposte, to the appropriateness of rights talks in all situations where it is the associative, interpersonal, and intimate aspects of life that are at stake. So Simon proposes as kind of a meta right, that the rights of people such as the Maori people and other indigenous groups to be able to communicate their ethical claims using ethical language and concepts that are their own concepts, rather than utilizing concepts such as human rights concepts, which might not be their own. And with that, I will pass on to David.
Yep. Thanks, Adam. So yeah, once again, thank you to the hosts, the ISRF, for this book launch. It's really appreciated, and thanks to Lars for his kind words at the beginning there. So kind of carry on with what Adam said, but also this is going to be something of a whistle-stop tour. So another important thing, so building on this idea of interests, another important theme for the collection is that we wanted, so the contributors kind of were thinking through the ways in which sociality interacts with the various concrete activities and practices that kind of, make up our social worlds. So at the broadest level, we get Rowan Croft, who considers the way communication and sociality interact with one another. And he argues that we have rights to be minimally skilled in order to be prepared for the forms of communication and the goods this kind of opens up, this opens us up to, that characterize our relations with others in an open modern society. So that's the kind of broadest level, is the kind of practices associated with communication. At the kind of the broadest level of policy, Bouke de Vries, as part of his contribution, he examines a range of ways that states might in fact, so a part of his contribution is examining the ways in which states can kind of plug certain gaps that are created by modern life. So he considers at one point, for instance, robots and kind of pets as a means of answering people's needs in a situation of emergency, but he also considers the justification for certain kinds of drugs that change people's perceptions of whether their social networks are deficient. And in so doing, kind of reducing the deleterious physiological and psychological consequences that something like chronic loneliness can cause. And at the same kind of this orientation towards policy, in James Nichols and Kim's epilogue, they expand on this kind of policy orientation by considering maybe instituting a special rapporteur on social human rights. So the kind that exists for housing at the moment, for instance. And that way you could kind of examine through this rapporteur a country's performance on social rights and then issue recommendations. And related to that, they consider the ways or the possibility for setting up committees to analyze policies in light of their impact on social human rights. So that's the kind of the policy level. I guess there's several chapters committed to thinking of the way in which sociality and work, practices associated with work, kind of interact with one another. So Jesse Tomalty argues we need to expand our understanding of working conditions, of what we mean by working conditions, to include reference to how our social rights, both in work and out of it, are affected by things like unstable shift patterns, commuting practices or commuting distances and lengths, and the way in which they might interact with child and healthcare provision and that kind of thing. So an expanded understanding of what good work might mean. And then in Chiara Codeli's article, so getting even more granular, she looks at the ways in which hiring practices might have to be adjusted. So she considers specifically how they might have to be anonymized to ensure that social networks do not provide unfair advantages to prospective candidates at a job interview. And then Elizabeth Brake's chapter, she draws attention to the fact that specifically care work falls at the moment disproportionately on the shoulders of women. And with this in mind, Elizabeth demands that states, while they're careful to fulfill their duties regarding citizens' social needs, need to kind of pay attention to the fact that they might also be exacerbating gender injustices. And so there's a need to both to kind of calibrate this such that the current maldistribution of emotional labor, this care work, is remedied alongside the state meeting its other needs. And in this way, then women and these other burdened groups can enjoy real and sustained freedom of association and specifically, as Elizabeth calls it, a right to be left alone. And then related to that, Anke Gaius, she takes this idea of kind of being left alone in a really interesting direction and examines the reciprocal relation between being well connected with others, so in intimate relationships, and also enjoying one's own company. And so she roots this ability to be both well connected and capable of enjoying solitude to early childcare practices, arguing that what children need is a diverse set of caregivers that includes both non-parental one-on-one care and institutional care at those kind of early age. And then finally, so in my own chapter, and I'd like to here thank Kim, because I never would have kind of alighted on this stuff about cities and social rights as they interact with them without her kind of paradigm of looking at these kinds of questions. I focus on the ways in which the built environment of cities can influence our social relations to others, both in terms of how we kind of relate to strangers in as micro interactions, but also in the way in which sprawl can impact on our ability both to begin and maintain more intimate relations. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour through the kind of practices and activities that we consider kind of in the latter half of this book. So I'll pass back to Lars now, I guess.
And we're going to move on to the three panelists now, who I'm going to introduce each in turn. And we're going to start with Charlie Richards, who is currently a DPhil candidate in politics at Nuffield College at the University of Oxford. His thesis seeks to offer a philosophical examination of the ethics and politics of social rights. And specifically, he's interested in establishing not only whether persons have social rights, but also what these rights might entail for how the state should treat us and also how we should treat each other. Seems to me that you are the perfect person to come and talk to us about this book, Charlie. So thanks very much for being here.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, well, thanks so much for the introduction, Lars, and thanks so much to the ISRF for hosting this great event, and thanks to the editors for writing this fantastic book. I echo a lot of the thoughts that Lars gave right at the top of the session, where he said that he was left a little bit cold by some of the human rights talk in general. And I had a very similar thought in political philosophy, which is why I've now turned my thesis into looking at these questions. A lot of people want to talk about the materialistic interests that people have, maybe, as Kim said, in shelter and resources and so on, but social interests seem to be neglected. And so I think that not only is this a fantastic book, it's also a very important book. But not only is it fantastic and important, but it's also interesting. I don't have very long, so I'm only going to be able to talk about a few interesting things, but hopefully I can pick a few cherries and get some interesting conversation going. So one very interesting thing that came to me from Stephanie Collins's chapter, where she explores whether there can be a human right to meaningful relationships such as friendship, things characterized by intimacy as opposed to our thinner social relationships. She says that the human right to relationship faces a distinctive motivation problem. And the thought goes something like, giving intimacy to others from a sense of obligation or duty, or because people have interfered with you in some way, undermines the value of the thing in question. To give intimacy as a duty might therefore be self-defeating in some kind of way, which poses a distinctive problem for thick social rights, such as the right to intimate relationships. A case of this that's given is the case of a friend or someone you think is a friend, and then finding out that they've been forced or paid to spend time with you. People would be pretty miffed by that, and they would probably come to the conclusion that that person was not in fact your friend. And I think this has very high stakes as a point. It would render the very notion of a direct human right to meaningful relationships self-defeating and potentially conceptually incoherent. And I think that this maybe also points to there being a big difference between different classes of social rights. Rights that are grounded maybe in our basic need for human contact and interaction against social deprivation, versus those rights that are more concerned with flourishing on the thicker end of the spectrum to do with friendship and so on. Some things did come to me when I read this point, however. First of all, it seems like there is a more complex relationship between obligation and meaningful relationships than we might at first consider. What about cases like a blind date? Imagine that someone goes on a blind date because they want their parents to stop nagging them. So they go on a date because they just want to get their parents off their back, and they feel some obligation to their parents to give the person a chance. They turn up to the date and then find out that they're great. They have a great time and they see each other again and they form an intimate relationship. I don't think in this case we want to say that the cause of the intimate relationship somehow tarnishes it later down the line. And I think this indicates that there can be a plausible and attractive duty to try to form a meaningful relationship. At least it makes it good at the start. So there is this complex relationship between obligations and motivations there. And theorizing the relationship between obligations and these relationships, I think, is therefore very important. So I think the big question here is, what is the proper relationship between obligations and thick social rights? I think this is incredibly important to get a pulse on the field and what the kind of potentiality of social rights is and how capacious it can be as a concept while retaining some kind of action guidingness and plausibility. So I'd be very interested to hear what people think and maybe unpack that more. Another very interesting thing that came up in Alexandra Couteau's chapter, where she looks at whether there can be a right to opportunities for meaningful relationships, was the claim that any right to meaningful relationships is a right to opportunities to form relationships and never to relationships as such. It's also said that this claim right that we have only properly applies to the state and not other individuals. She says, I quote, "No specific individual will be required to discharge the duty themselves. especially obnoxious people like the famous Grumpy Gertrude. And I think that this is a particularly conventional view on what social rights do in fact entitle us to, that echoes throughout the book and in the literature more generally, that the social rights we have first and foremost attached towards institutions as opposed to individuals in the first instance. But I wondered whether this was entirely true, or at least whether there was more to say about these things. So in the first instance, it seems like in other cases involving basic needs, we do think that individuals have a duty to provide aid, even when the state has ensured fair opportunities. So to dust off a pond case, imagine someone falls into a pond despite the fact that the state has provided ample provision in safety measures that makes it highly unlikely that someone would in fact find themselves in that position. It would seem strange to say that because the state has provided the fair opportunity not to fall into the pond, our social obligation or our obligations to that person in that case are somehow expunged. And I think that if this is true, and the stakes of sociability are as high as I believe they are, and the editors and the writers in the book seem to think they are, that fair equality of opportunity to form relationships might not be sufficient. As individuals, you might also have to step up the plate, even when the state does its fair share. I think we also do not think that our duties of aid are generally diffused as a result of obnoxiousness. So maybe Grumpy Gertrude, even her, is still entitled to some kind of social interaction. And finally, I'm not sure whether there is anything special about the state being the duty bearer in these cases. The state might be very good at coordinating the provision of social goods and opportunities, but social duties to meet basic needs seems to adhere with individuals ultimately, as we saw in the pond case, given that individuals are not off the hook even when fair opportunities are secured. I think an account of why it is the state in particular who is the duty bearer in these cases as opposed to individuals is therefore needed. And I think it's also a deeply important and interesting thing to consider. So to wrap up, the big questions that came to me while I was reading the book is firstly, what as individuals are our social obligations before appropriate institutions are formed and once they have been formed, if anything? And secondly, why might the state be special in some way as a duty holder when it comes to social rights as opposed to individuals? But just to finish the compliment sandwich, I think it's a fantastic book. You should read it, engage with it, and I think that it's going to make an incredibly lasting contribution to an exciting and emerging field. So thanks everyone once again.
Moving on to Adam Eatonson, who is a senior lecturer in the School of Philosophical, Anthropological and Film Studies at the University of St. Andrews. His work explores topics in ethics, political philosophy, moral psychology, and social epistemology. And at the moment, he's working on 3 aspects of human emotional life, namely remorse, acceptance, and the experience of wonder, which I think is a fantastic project to do research on, and I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes. Thanks very much for being here, Adam.
Yeah, so I just wanted to share and echo the congratulations that others have expressed to Kim and David and Adam. It really is an engaging and innovative volume. I genuinely enjoyed reading it, which is not an experience I take for granted, especially after recently going through the hard labors of editing a very large human rights volume myself. So thank you for that. I think the book, for all the reasons mentioned, explores a fresh, inspiring, important topic within the philosophy of human rights, a new topic in many ways. And it handles it from so many rich and innovative directions. It's a marvelous thing to see and a huge contribution to the field. So again, congratulations. So the volume makes a very strong case, I think, for what it calls social human rights, which, as the editors have explained and others have explained, are rights to adequate opportunities to form meaningful social relationships, including intimate relationships, and to interactional inclusion in the life of society in general. So I find the idea of social human rights and the case or cases made for it in the volume very plausible, personally. I also agree with what many of the authors say about the specific content of these rights, the ways we can work out their practical implications. I particularly like the very relatable idea that an important component of social inclusion is this capacity to have meaningful, even if very small, day-to-day micro-interactions with acquaintances, even strangers in the street, a coffee shop, a grocery store, something that Professor Brownlee brings up very nicely in her chapter. So nobody in the volume, as far as I'm aware, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, asserts a right against loneliness per se. And I assume that the reason for that is that the avoidance of loneliness is to a very large extent dependent on the choices made by an agent herself. So avoiding loneliness isn't something that can be securely provided to an agent, I take it, in the same way that mere opportunities for interaction can. So you might have all the opportunities for social bonding you could ever want, and yet remain lonely because you don't make anything of those opportunities. So the prevention of loneliness seems, I take it, outside the direct purview of interactional and institutional rights. And for those reasons, it probably makes more sense to think of rights against exclusion, as the authors do, rather than a right against loneliness per se. Still, mitigating the real-world risk of loneliness and worrying about the dangers of loneliness, whether these are psychological dangers, health-related dangers, other kinds of dangers, is part of the point, I take it, of a right to social inclusion, which of course the volume is concerned to address and defend. And evidently it's like a major concern or interest underlying the case for social human rights in general. So part of the purpose, or one of the purposes of such rights, as I understand it, is to lessen the risk or likelihood of loneliness for people. So in the very, very short time I have, I wanted to talk about loneliness, and in particular, what I thought to be a very interesting strategy proposed in the volume to help mitigate the risk. One such strategy to help mitigate the risk of loneliness, and this is Anke Gauss's idea that one way to combat loneliness is to help people find comfort in solitude. So that sounds contradictory, but as Gauss explains, loneliness isn't just the state of being alone, it's a kind of suffering or a pain or an unpleasant yearning that one experiences when they are alone, and in particular when they perceive themselves to have a lack of emotional connection with others. So if that's what loneliness is, then one obvious way to combat loneliness is precisely to help people find ways of tolerating, maybe even enjoying the state of solitude, right? The state of being alone. If you can do this, then loneliness is curtailed because, though you might be alone, you're not suffering from that, or at least you're suffering less. So that's one direct way in which, accepting solitude or somehow celebrating solitude or enjoying or tolerating solitude might help us combat loneliness. She says there are other ways, indirect ways in which it can do this as well. So one is that, as she puts it, a person who values being alone is safeguarded against rushing into the company of others as a means of avoiding their own. Since rushing into unfulfilling relationships invites feelings of loneliness, the capacity to be alone is thus a partial protection against loneliness. That's one indirect reason. A second indirect reason why a capacity for solitude is useful, she thinks, in combating loneliness, is that it's going to help us form more meaningful and genuine relationships in the long run, or in general. Why? Because it enables us to approach relationships with a more secure or mature understanding of ourselves. In other words, it allows us to have some kind of self-knowledge, or important self-knowledge. So I think the thought here, it seems, is that being able to be alone, being able to tolerate and perhaps even enjoy solitude at times, or some degree of solitude, is necessary for us to understand our own true wants and needs, and thus to make and to understand the demands we need to make in relationships in order to make those relationships genuine and authentic. And I think those are some very plausible and interesting observations. Part of what it means is that you can't solve, as Gauss points out, you can't solve the problem of loneliness just by designing policies to allow for social interaction and inclusion. Because you can be with others, but nonetheless still feel lonely because we lack meaningful connections with those around us. So in addition to inclusion, we need to find ways of cultivating an appreciation for solitude, Gauss argues. In particular, she says we ought to provide small children with the psychological wherewithal to tolerate solitude, to teach older ones to enjoy it, and possibly to provide people with protected me time by removing the social stigma associated with voluntary solitude. Now, again, all this sounds very plausible and fascinating to me. I'll just give you, because I don't have any time left, just 2 cents, 2 thoughts that Professor Gauss's chapter provoked on my part. So one worry I had is about the potential risks of encouraging people to tolerate and perhaps even enjoy solitude. So obviously, the complete inability to be alone seems like a vice, like a bad thing. But so too, I assume, is the inability to engage in close, loving relationships. And I wonder whether we might risk creating that kind of incapacity by celebrating solitude. So I could think of very close friends, personally, who so enjoy being alone, and the freedom from compromise involved in being alone, that to me it seems they've in a way lost the capacity to form intimate romantic relationships, in particular, because of the restrictions and compromises that those kinds of relations naturally involve. So that's one worry. Like, how do you avoid the potential vices engendered by the celebration of solitude? How do you balance this out? And then the final question I had is just about this task of, which I find very plausible and appealing in some way, the task of removing the social stigma that we often attach to solitude. A strategy that Gauss only tentatively supports or recommends. So the question that I have is, like, what concretely might that involve? So David Jenkins's chapter actually brings up an interesting example on his chapter on the social right to the city, where he suggests that we might use the landscape of the city to imaginatively reflect on the experience of loneliness in cities. And one example he gives of this is a statue erected in Kunming of a local loner, you might say, someone named Wu Qingheng, who had a statue erected near his house and was sort of known to people, but didn't have any close friends. He would feed, I think it was pigeons or something like that. And that might be a way of sort of destigmatizing that kind of life. But I wonder if we have a duty to do this, to destigmatize solitude. Could it also be that we have a duty, and that governments, in fact, may well have a duty to create other kinds of media that has this kind of destigmatizing effect? So if you think about shows like Seinfeld or Sex and the City, they probably did do something to normalize being single in one's 30s or 40s, right, in the city. And I wonder, if the thought, one of the thoughts that naturally flows from this chapter is that, we have a duty to create more media like that. And it's not an entirely implausible thought, but it's not entirely self-evident either. And I'm wondering what my hesitancies are. Maybe it's rights to artistic freedom or something like that. But it's certainly something worthy of thought. And so I'm just indebted to Professor Gauss and this chapter, and of course the whole volume, for just provoking some interesting thoughts on my part. I hope that's a useful contribution to the discussion, and thank you very much again for having me as a panelist.
Okay, we're going to go on with the third presenter on this panel, who is Laura Valentini, who is a professor of philosophy and political theory at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Her work is situated in the fields of contemporary political, legal, and moral philosophy, and her particular research interests include, but are not limited to, global justice, democracy, freedom, and human rights. In 2011, she published a book that is entitled Justice in a Globalized World in Normative Framework. It's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Great. Thank you very much, Lars, for this kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to comment on this really spectacularly good book, because as my colleagues before me have pointed out, it's full of great insights, and because it puts sort of the very center of our thinking about rights in general and human rights, particularly something that is crucially important to our human lives, that is the social dimension, which has not been, as others have said, as so great a focus of discussion up to this point. So I only have praise for the book. However, in the spirit of generating philosophical debate and controversy, I'm going to offer some skeptical remarks about the very framing of the question of social access in terms of human rights. Not because I'm necessarily skeptical about it myself, but because I think that there could be plausible reasons for skepticism, and I would like to see those reasons more directly addressed, although there are some bits of the book which refer to them. So I'm not going to focus on any specific chapter in the book, but I'm actually going to focus on the general framing of the problem, that is that we have human rights in particular to social access. And I take it the master argument that is being made in the book is made of the following two premises and then conclusions. So the first premise is something like this: in order to lead minimally decent lives, human beings need access to social contact, where the social contact in question can be sort of cursory, just in day-to-day interactions, at the grocery store and so on, as some others have mentioned, as well as deep in the form of intimate relationships such as friendships or marriage and so on. So this is necessary for people to lead minimally decent lives. Now, human rights, what do? They capture what people need to lead minimally decent lives. And if we hold these two beliefs about the necessity of social contact for minimally decent lives and the job of human rights, that is to capture what people need to lead minimally decent lives, then it seems to follow naturally that we have human rights to adequate access to social contact. And this includes rights to adequate access to love, to intimacy, to the epistemic goods that are inherent in belonging to certain particular networks, to participate in the life of the society, to work conditions that still allow for the formation of good quality relationships in the workplace and outside the workplace, and so on and so forth. And so this is, I take it, the main idea of the book. I only cited a very small subset of all the dimensions of adequate social access, but hopefully that's enough to give you an idea. Now, I entirely 3,000,000% agree, if one can 3,000,000% agree, that social access is crucial for us. B, that governments ought to strive to provide individuals with adequate access to social contact, and that also human beings in their day-to-day lives should be sensitive to these social access concerns. What exactly they ought to be doing, I think, is a very important question that Charlie, I think, earlier on raised. And I'm not going to be speaking about that. But I do think that there must be responsibilities both on governments and on individuals in relation to social access. Social access, I mean access to social contact. What I wonder is whether these responsibilities are best expressed in the language of human rights. And the reason is that sometimes I think it's plausible to believe that human rights capture what people need to lead minimally decent lives, but they don't only capture what people need to lead minimally decent lives. In particular, they capture what people need to lead minimally decent lives, which others are under obligations to provide to them. So there's always an obligation on the other side. And this is a more controversial claim, but I think it's at least internal to a particular strand of thinking about human rights and their role in ethical thinking. When the obligations that are correlative to human rights are not fulfilled, the kind of wrong that occurs aptly triggers some kind of international concern. That is, that it's a wrong that has a special feature of triggering a certain kind of moral political alarm bell, the alarm bells that should make other states or other agents within the international arena worried about what's happening in a particular context. So trigger international concern. And, related to this thought is that when human rights are being violated, the state is not doing its job properly, and so its entitlement to full-blown, total sovereignty over its particular domain of jurisdiction is being somewhat diminished, although this doesn't, of course, open the way to intervention and stuff like that. But it's just that one possible objection to certain forms of intervention, including just diplomatic criticism and things like that, not necessarily armed intervention or sanctions and so on, is being removed. Now, the first dimension that I mentioned, so the idea that human rights capture what people need to lead minimally decent lives, which others are under an obligation to provide to them, is, I think, not typical of human rights specifically, but of the idea of rights in general, and human rights are just a subset of that. And the issue of international concern, triggering international concern, I think of as being more specific to human rights. And my worry is that if we look specifically at those aspects of the alleged human right to social access that are not already covered by other more familiar human rights, so freedom of association, freedom of movement, access to healthcare, freedom from poverty, non-discrimination, and so on, which obviously also have a great impact on social access. So, if you don't have freedom of association, freedom of movement, if you're extremely poor, if you don't have access to healthcare, then your ability to access meaningful social relationship or social connections also greatly diminishes. So if we look at those dimensions of the right to social access that are not already sort of taken care of by these more familiar rights, I worry, or I wonder whether the framework of human rights as I've just presented it really does apply. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples that appear here and there in the book. So, for instance, we may regard as a under-fulfillment or violation of a right to adequate social access for instance, the fact that patients might be held in long-term quarantine without opportunities for social contact, that residential care facilities lack regular intergenerational contact. So, for instance, there aren't school visits there. That children are not really being educated about the importance of both deep, meaningful relationships, but also day-to-day interactions, sort of cursory ones that we have on the street, that we have at the workplace, that we have in shops, etc. There being insufficient provisions of public space in general and public spaces for play. There not being sufficiently affordable, reliable, and widespread public transport. And I mean, this is perhaps the most extreme case, individuals, perhaps ones that are generally considered unattractive for some reason, not having sufficient opportunities for intimate social contact. So these could all be regarded as under-fulfillments of an alleged human rights to social inclusion, at least from what I understand from most parts of the book. And my worry is that I'm not sure that the notion of human rights really fits here. And this is what I will conclude my contribution with. So suppose, for instance, that patients in a residential care facility don't receive school visits on a regular basis. To whom should they complain? So who is the duty bearer here? Who has a duty to ensure that these regular visits happen? Or suppose that, again, this is the extreme case, someone unattractive doesn't have sufficient opportunities for intimate social contact. To whom should he or she, they complain? Or suppose that we have a state that does its best to try to provide everything it needs for its citizens, but just has limited resources. And so it cannot provide all at the same time very good healthcare, excellent public transport, optimal educational provision, etc., etc. In these cases, not everything that is necessary for social access is going to be something that the state can do. And if ought implies can, as some believe, then the state cannot be under an obligation to provide everything that is necessary for adequate social access. So in these cases, it would be odd to suggest that nonetheless, individuals have a right to all of the dimensions of adequate social access in those kinds of situations, and to suggest that the state, therefore, even if it's not in a position to provide, is a human rights violator for that reason. But even more importantly, in all of the examples that I've mentioned, although I think we have reason to be morally concerned about the situation of the individuals that I just described, the ones who are, don't have intergenerational contact in the care home, the ones who don't have sufficient public spaces where they can meet, sufficiently reliable and affordable public transport, and so on. So I think that these are all morally important problems. I'm not sure that these are the kinds of moral problems that should trigger international concern of some kind. And if we think, and of course this is an assumption that might be debated, but that when we use the language of human rights, we're pointing to particular kind of wrongs that are not just very grave, but the ones that are apt for a particular kind of international concern to be triggered, then the question arises as to whether these kinds of social rights should be included within the set of human rights. And so the broader question that is behind my intervention really is about what is special about human rights, what's the best way of thinking about this very particular moral category, and whether this moral category should be as, and now I'm going to use a funny word, chubby, as to include everything that has to do with adequate access to social connection, which again, I agree is absolutely crucial to lead minimally decent lives. So thank you very much again to the editors and contributors for a fantastic book.
Great. Thank you very much, Charlie, Adam, Laura. Those are extremely helpful comments, and thank you for your kind endorsements of the volume. I'll say two things very briefly in reply to Charlie, and starting with the thought he drew from Stephanie Collins' chapter, this worry that human rights to relationships might face a motivational problem, that in the realm of intimacy, if we think someone has a duty to provide care or indeed to provide love, that would destroy the value of the object of the right, that the right to be loved is in a way self-defeating because it destroys the value of the love for the right holder. John Tassiolis has made a similar point. He makes it specifically with respect to romantic love. But I think if we take Matthew Liao as our starting point and look at a child's right to be loved, my intuition, at least, is that the value of being loved is not destroyed by the idea that the parent doing the loving has a duty to love, because so much around being loved is built up in what is nourishing for a child. Now, we might say, is it love if it's the object of duty? I think there's a difference between, as philosophers all know, there's a difference between our decision-making procedures and the criteria by which we judge right action. So when I am loving my child, the thing that should be uppermost in my mind, in my decision-making, is my love. Mine. If we look afterwards whether I did well toward my child, we can look at what my duties are, including my duties to love my child. And I think if we start with that, then when we look at other types of relationships, including romantic, it doesn't seem quite as strange to say the language of duty is appropriate. And John Tomasi has a valuable point on intimate connections, because some kinds of concepts that matter a lot in intimate relationships don't make sense without the notion of rights. So he says, we cannot most properly be generous with what we don't know is ours. In order to be generous with something, we have to know that we own it. We have to have a property right over it in some sense in order to then be generous with it to those we love. We cannot truly forgive, he says, without the idea of a debt. Right? So a debt is, again, sort of a rights-related concept, that something is owed. We've wronged someone, we've been wronged, and then we forgive. And forgiveness and generosity, those are two core virtues of intimacy, but they rely on the notion of rights in order for us to flesh them out. So that's there's a lot more that can be said under that heading, but I think we shouldn't be too quick to say that something's gone awry when we introduce the language of duty and relate into intimate relationships. And the other point that Charlie's stressed, which is very interesting, is when we're thinking about duty bearers and the duties in relation to intimate relationships, should we, as Quoto focuses, should we focus on the state? And the state is the primary duty bearer when it comes to human rights, and it's, at least with respect to social rights, it's stepping too far to say we have rights against individual persons or rights against all individual people, apart from sort of negative rights, that they not interfere with our efforts to form bonds. And I'm very friendly to the idea that our social human rights they not only correlate with duties by the state, they also correlate with duties in other individual people. And it's partly because the business of associating starts off in the business of interaction. And there we can talk about a range of duties we have. And Leslie Green has some very nice thoughts on what it means to respect each other. So having a duty of respect toward other people. And he says, for the people who fall within your general sphere of concern, the people about whom you meaningfully can think, and that includes not just the children in your house or your colleagues at work, but also the homeless person you see on the street when you pass them by. He says that for the people who fall within your general sphere of concern, respecting them means not just that when you think about them in a way that is consistent with their value. We think about them with respect, but you also have a duty actively to think about them, that failing to think about the people in your general sphere of concern, that's sort of the first step in a failure of a duty to honor them as people. And so if we start with that, sort of the duties of interaction is the petri dish in which we form more lasting connections. And we have to be very attentive to whether connections forming, but it wouldn't be good for it to form overall, or whether we are really needed in this connection. But if we start in that space, then there's a lot of scope to consider the obligations we have as individuals, not just the obligations of the state toward people in relation to their social rights. So I'll stop there and hopefully come back during discussion. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you to all the speakers. Thank you particularly to Adam, because I know that you have a baby on the way and the due date is a matter of days. So congratulations for that, and thanks for being with us. I wanted to, and thank you for your kind words. I wanted to just talk in relation to pick up on a couple of things that Adam talked about. So yes, we don't have a right against loneliness. I don't think any of the contributors in this collection have argued that we do. That there is a range of psychological and health harms associated with loneliness, but that it's important not to confuse loneliness and social isolation, because loneliness is a somewhat subjective notion, because we can have access to plentiful relationships, but we may just feel those relationships are insufficient, they may not meet our needs. But then if those relationships are subjectively seen to be inefficient, but if loneliness is harmful, then maybe the relationships themselves are inefficient. Sorry, my cat is like being a distraction. So yes, and Adam talked about the dangers of solitude, and the worry that the celebration of solitude may lead to an inability of people to engage in kind of loving, intimate relationships. Now, I would agree with this to some degree. However, I would question whether being able to enjoy solitude or periods of solitude and to celebrate that solitude is necessarily going to create an inability to engage in romantic relationships. So it might provide someone with more choice, because they don't have to be attached to someone at all times, so they can have that freedom to be more selective in their relationships. And I would also flip that and say that actually there are relationships that can cause people to have an inability to engage in intimate type of relationships. So if you think of some of abusive relationships, many domestic violence situations, many people are damaged from relationships that make it the case that it's very difficult for them to engage in intimate relationships. in terms of, so you talked about the stigma to do with removing the social stigma. So yeah, I think David's idea is good, and utilizing media to avoid to remove the stigma, I think, is a good idea. Education in schools is always good. So I think we do have a duty to provide relationship education, which should include the importance of solitude and the acceptability of solitude. And currently there's a kind of a big trend to do with mindfulness, meditations. And I think those sort of things tend to be enjoying periods of solitude to yourself. So I think those sort of things as well is going to help to remove the social stigma. And with that, I'll pass on to David.
Yeah, so I think Laura's gone, but thank you very much for her. No, she's still there. Okay, great. Okay, yeah. So as always, Laura was very precise there and very analytical in her laying out this problem. So what I take it basically is there's a sense in which, yes, this concern with social rights theorists, with the contributors to this volume, that it's kind of a necessary. These are all necessary constitutive parts of what it means to be human, and therefore there is a certain level of seriousness that occurs when these needs are not met. And then so that's one necessary but not sufficient part of the human rights, the ways in which we use human rights. The second level is that it has to trigger this kind of international concern. So I guess the main thing I would say here is the fact that this triggering seems a very contingent fact. It's not something that right, it's something with its own institutional biases. It's going to have certain things will be triggered because that's the way in which the kind of balance of powers at the international level are kind of currently relating to one another. And so it might be that the reason these things are not triggered is not because they're not sufficiently serious. It's simply because the way in which international politics, the way in which these regimes develop, is kind of constituted in such a way that they just don't trigger something that's incredibly serious. So the way in which I would think about this, in fact, would be that the flow of concern might be from the South, the global South, critiquing these kind of deeply individualized cities in particular. I guess that's my area of concern. So that's where I kind of gravitate. So think of the way in which Japan produces several thousands, maybe even, I think it was 4% of funerals like a decade ago were so-called lonely deaths, where people died alone in their apartments. Their bodies were not discovered for months, sometimes years. And so I can imagine someone in the global South thinking that that was a pretty horrific state of affairs, but the triggering effect of that, given the balance of powers, just isn't taking place. So, but that's a contingent feature of the system. That's simply because the way in which international regimes are set up just tends not to trigger those kinds of concerns. So I would say that the seriousness should be sufficient, and if, for instance, the international concern isn't triggered, then that's maybe some reason to doubt whether the international mechanisms for triggering these kinds of things are functioning. So one way of thinking about that would be to think of the way in which a rapporteur, a UN rapporteur, in fact, in the UK context, criticized in quite profound ways our housing situation, and she was dismissed as a Marxist. She's a Brazilian Marxist, Rachel Rolnick, and we got on with our day. So I would say that would be a sign of things having gone wrong, because the trigger was there, but it was the UN critiquing the UK, and so it didn't really kind of develop into anything. So yeah, so I guess I don't really want to take up any more time, so I guess I'll leave it there for now, and then we'll maybe this will come back in the discussion. So cheers, Laura.
Thanks, David, and thanks to Adam and Kim as well. And we've got about 15 minutes or so, slightly more than that, for questions. We've already got two very interesting comments in the Q&A box, which I'm now going to turn to. But in the meantime, I'd invite the audience to share their thoughts, share some questions. maybe offer some feedback if they want to, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can. Starting with the first question that's been raised, which was raised by an anonymous attendee, which goes, to what extent do the analyses and recommendations in this book draw upon varied global contexts? I got the impression from the examples mentioned in the presentations that chapters are heavily based on global North contexts. Over to the panel.
I'm happy to start an answer to that. I think so. The questioner is right that many of the contributors come from the global North and represent those perspectives. It's not universally true, and one very powerful chapter in the collection is that focuses on the global South, is from Simon Hope, who originally draws from Australia and who really questions the merits of using human rights as the lingua franca in terms of talking about the injustices toward the Maori people. I think the other thing that I would add on to what David has said in terms of which rights tend to be given priority, this very individualistic Western image, the civil and political rights being so dominant, it actually points to so the designers of the international agreements that we reference in many of these debates, they missed a trick in the discussion of oppression, because that was one of the driving reasons for developing the UDHR. Following the Second World War, Eleanor Roosevelt, as the first United States ambassador to the UN, working with other nations to develop this document, the focus was how the conscience of humanity has just been shocked by this event. How do we protect what's most fundamental for human beings? And the need to protect from oppression, there was, in the final version, it overlooks the fact that the most potent weapon of oppression a government can wield against its people are their social rights. Disappearing family members, breaking up families, taking children away from parents. This is how you destroy a people, is to attack their social rights. And so there's the book, although it sort of uses the analytic framework that we've inherited from the global North, it's trying to push an image of people and what matters most that is not prominent in the global North. That is more, as David said, more prominent in the global South, and indeed countries in those conversations and the design of these documents tried to push for the recognition of social rights, and at least initially lost out in those conversations. So I'll pause. I'll stop there. If David, Adam, or any of the other speakers want to come in.
Maybe just, this sounds like I'm defending my chapter, but the social rights of the city, for instance, has been utilized by movements in the global South, so in Brazil in particular. So I would say that this is kind of the universality that's operating at this is both a way to kind of undercut the individualism that characterizes kind of Western traditions in political philosophy, and also to bring in these other frames of reference to kind of thicken up essentially what it means to be human. So yeah, that was defensive.
Adam, did you want to come in here, or shall we take the next question?
I think we can take the next question.
All right, great. So we've got another anonymous question, or comment, I suppose. It says, I am seriously in doubt that being poor means having less access to social relations. It seems to depend on what we mean by social relations. Social capital seems to be a powerful social relation, and maybe that is what is at stake. Still, to focus on social capital relations means to forget, or perhaps to minimize, the power of communal, community, and family relations that are social and nurturing, even though they are not necessarily empowering the individual to have upward social mobility.
Can I come in on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I don't think that anyone's saying that to be poor is to lack social relations. But there are various different ways in which being poor is going to have or could have an effect on social relationships. So, for example, Kim talked in the introduction about people need a certain amount of material and temporal resources to be able to engage in certain social activities. So, for example, just being able to go out for a drink is going to cost a certain amount of money, and not being able to pay for certain social activities is potentially going to exclude you from being able to engage in certain activities. If you're poor, you may be working longer hours, you may be forced to work multiple jobs, and in those cases you may not be available, or you may be too exhausted to kind of really meet social needs and develop certain social relationships. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to have any access to relationships or anything like that. And indeed, there are many great communities of people in poverty that who look after each other and so on. There is another aspect in which, or another way in which being poor can affect social relationships. So Amartya Sen talks about a need that we have is being able to appear in public without shame. And to be able to appear in public without shame, we need to project a certain appearance, and that requires material resources. So to appear in public, in shabby, kind of smelly clothes and so on, has the unfortunate effect often of affecting your relationships with the wider community. And in Kim's chapter, Kim talks about the importance of those microcosms of interactions. It's often people who are poor, often people who are out on the streets who aren't receiving those kind of micro interactions. Good morning, how's your day? And so on. They're not getting that affirmation and respect from the wider community. And they're the ones that are most kind of affected by that. So I think, though, I'm not sure if that totally answers the question, or if anyone else wants to chip in, but
if I can add one supplement, that so the impact poverty can have on your social rights, it's not purely in being isolating, it can be overcrowding. So if you have more people than rooms in your house, and this is one thing Adam discusses in his work. David and I did some work on the impact of the pandemic on people in terms of their housing situation. Your housing might be adequate in ordinary times, but become inadequate during lockdown when you're required to spend 24 hours with a small, certain set of people in a small space, and it's a setting is perfect for abuse and violence. So the idea of having a right against social deprivation, a right to have adequate access to decent human contact, the decent bit of that is doing a lot of work. If you're in an overcrowded prison, you're surrounded by people, lots of social contact, but not a setting conducive to decency. So it'd be just one other reason where poverty can impact social rights.
Yeah, I'll chip in finally. We still have 9 minutes, right? So I would also say just how contingent this fact is the way we understand wealth, right, is in the question it's implied that it's kind of monetary, whereas kind of if you think about kind of E.P. Thompson's work on the ways in which people were kind of driven into the factories in order to turn them into workers, and this kind of goes back to Kim's point as well, is that these humans their social connections were destroyed, they were made poorer, they were turned into a certain kind of laborer such that they could be then pressed into the service of this kind of industrial machine. And so the way in which we understand kind of contemporary poverty should really take into account the fact that it leads to these kinds of kind of deleterious effects on people's social connections. So although the peasants who were channeled into the factories might well have been wealthier in some set, they had an entire way of life that was destroyed and were impoverished and immiserated through the destruction of their social rights. So I guess a sufficiently broad understanding of poverty would include reference to the connections and the communality and these associational goods that are so central to a decent life.
Thanks all. I have a question that I might abuse the position of chair to bat onto the table here. And that is, taking on something that Kim just said, actually, which is that some concepts are doing quite a lot of theoretical work here. And my specific question is, we're all familiar with the idea that if somebody has a right, somebody else has an obligation. I wonder whether if there are rights and governments or states or international bodies or communities need to sort of fulfill those in some form or another, measurement is needed in order to be able to assess whether or not those rights are being met. So tools need to be in place for governments to be able to assess whether or not these rights are being met. I wonder when it comes to social rights, whether there's a sort of a potential problem here, which is that the obvious question that raises is when the focus of these rights is emotional or perhaps even existential, how do we gauge those things? Do we go around asking people, are you lonely or not? Have you got adequate access to social interaction or not? And if that is the case, then how would that work? But also, are we potentially opening the door to, government coming in and asking all sorts of private or intimate information that they don't necessarily have the right to know? That may seem like a pragmatic question, but it becomes a philosophical question, I think, once you start to think through the sort of weight that concepts like adequate social access or a bearable life play here. I realize it's a broad question, but yeah, I was thinking this as I was reading the book, and then Kim, just then you raised this again, and it just made that question come up again. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts in relation to this.
I'm happy to say a few words on this.
Yeah, go for it, Charlie.
It's something that I've been thinking about a little bit. So I think the first thing to say is that in this question, it probably makes sense to combine a lot of these concerns in pre-existing institutional structures, right? So I heard something that apparently GPs in the UK have said that 1 in every 5 people that come through their doors for an appointment has a loneliness-related issue or kind of social deprivation-related issue. But at the moment, there isn't any kind of official recognition of this as a kind of weighty enough interest to be treated in particular kinds of ways, right? And the provisions aren't really there. So in the first case, it makes sense to widen the scope of people who are already assigned with formal obligations to look out for the interests of vulnerable people in society, right? So whether that's doctors or whether that might even be teachers who are looking after children at schools, or people in the health service more generally. So I think the first thing to say is that I think you can maybe capture this quite easily by implementing it into a wider system of social care in the first place. In terms of like measurement specifically, I think that it's complicated, right? And I'm not a policy expert, so you're going to have to speak to the wonks. But I do think people are quite skeptical about self-reporting, right? Because they see it as a kind of mechanism that's rife for abuse. How do we know these people are genuine and so on and so forth? But I think that self-reporting can be like a highly valuable thing, even if it means that some people might come in for, like dubious reasons or insincere reasons. I think that when you design social policies that are trying to capture and protect like extremely weighty interests, it's much better to have more false positives rather than false negatives, right? And you see this in the kind of employment system. It's much better to have a system where the people who really need the help get it, even if some people get access to resources they don't necessarily need, rather than creating an incredibly restrictive service where you're actually missing people out, right? And putting them through difficult situations. So I think that I'm probably like a big fan of self-reporting and trying to roll this into like a wider healthcare, wider kind of issue for provision. But yeah, there are going to be difficult questions about how you make this precise. And I'm not the person to say anything about that, I suppose.
Can I add one footnote to that? So our health, that's one reference point. And then, yes, we've got the problem Lars raises of how do you determine when someone is socially malnourished, when they're starting to manifest enough acute stress that this should be taken seriously as a human rights issue. But that isn't the reference point for all social rights. So someone in prison being denied access to family because their behavior isn't what the prison guards are wanting. If you accept the claim that some social rights are basic, then they're secure and they shouldn't depend on good behavior. Mm-hmm. So even if this person doesn't deteriorate health-wise, they have been robbed of a human right to have access to their family because we have sociality interests distinct from our welfare, our sort of health-related interests.
Thank you very much, Kim. We are close to running out of time, and I do apologize for people who I think wanted to enter into the conversation, but we've just not got the time to do that, unfortunately. So I do apologize. Before we sign off, I just wanted to hear finally from David and Adam for some final thoughts, maybe some final short closing comments before we all sign off. David?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just carry on what was being talked about just then. So this idea of self-reporting and the measurements, and I think a large, this is kind of going back to Adam's point, and this idea of destigmatizing loneliness. So the more sensitive the individuals themselves are, not only to kind of other people's loneliness, but also to their own kind of the health effects, rather than kind of be very robust individuals kind of accepting their own frailty and their own need for other people. I think that is also going to help with these issues of kind of measuring and assessing where the lack of the problem of meeting these social needs is kind of raising its head.
All right, brilliant. Adam, final word is yours.
I just wanted to point out that there are surveys that do measure kind of social relationships and these sort of things. So, for example, the OECD have a survey where they measure social relationships, and the Global Happiness Index, I believe, also does a similar thing. So these can be expanded as well. And yeah, I mean, just to thank everybody for their contributions, and thank you for everyone attending, and thank you, Lars, for presenting.
You're very welcome. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and for your very thoughtful contributions.